Welcome. In this edition, three noted historians and educators will report on their recent visit to Ghana, the first nation in Africa to gain independence from European colonial rule on the 6th of March, 1957. We'll ask our guests why they made the trip and of what relevance Ghana is to the sons and daughters of Africa here in the United States. We'll get started in a moment. Bids welcome to Professor John Henrik Clarke, the noted historian. Also bids welcome to Dr. Mary Hoover, professor in the Education Department at Howard University. And also a warm welcome to Professor James Small at CCNY's Africana Studies Department. Welcome to Like It Is. What was the reason for your trip?
Well, the reason for the trip was basically to attend the National Council of Black Studies conference in Ghana. We have been recommending for years that American black organizations hold conferences in Africa instead of spending money in Europe and all the American large hotels making other people rich. This conference was very successful in as much as we discovered that the intellects are getting together with less argumentation than the politicians. It also gave us the time to really look at Ghana holistically, because Ghana was the example of an African state set in motion by Nkrumah to be the role model of what an African managed state could be. We saw attempts to restore what had been lost since Nkrumah, and we saw other attempts not quite so complementary in Ghana. Several currents, some working opposite to the other. And the main thing that broke most of our hearts is the fact that Ghana is not managing its wealth-producing resources. We know that a nation must manage its wealth-producing resources if it's going to remain a sovereign state.
What was the stated agenda of the conference, Professor Hoover?
The theme of the conference was global transformations and social trends in Africanizing Black Studies. This was the 17th annual conference of the National Conference of Black Studies, the first one held in Africa. And so for me, it was quite a treat. I have been teaching courses related to Afrocentric education for years, and though I had been to Tanzania for the 6th Pan-African Congress and to South Africa, I had never traveled to West Africa. So I wanted to travel there to enhance my information and knowledge related to Afrocentric education. And I was very, very pleased with the trip.
Professor Small, what would you say was the outcome of this conference, and what did you glean from it in particular?
Well, as Dr. Clarke stated when we talked, was that this conference was more of a Pan-African conference than Six-Pack in Tanzania, and that the focus was not divided into alien ideological discussions, but this focus was on Pan-Africanism, and the focus was on beginning to understand Africa using an African cultural filter rather than European cultural and ideological filters, so that we were able to watch the Ghanaian professors and intellectuals describe their situation educationally, politically, socially. We were able to watch the African from the United States do the same thing, the African from the Caribbean do the same thing, so that as African, we were able to loan our perspective using an African cultural filter to the problems that must be solved by Africans for Africa.
Before we get into what problems must be solved for Africa by Africans, a word or two about Kwame Nkrumah. He received his education, as I understand it, in England. How was he able to withstand being overwhelmed by the European concept. How did he survive that to come back and be such a strong nationalist?
He received most of his education in the United States, and he received an informal education in the United States that is not often talked about.
Talk about it.
He walked the streets of Harlem. He argued with street speakers and African nationalists. He was a member of the Old Harlem History Club. And one summer, unemployed, he sold fish on the streets of Harlem. He worked in a soap factory. He went through the American Maya. His period in London was short in comparison to a long period in the United States. And he came under the persuasion of one of the great Caribbean minds of that day, George Padmore, C.L.R. James, those fine cadre of Caribbean theoreticians and thinkers of Pan-Africanism who spoke of African unity, although they never unified a single Caribbean island. They did greater work outside of the Caribbean area, mainly George Padmore, who was really Nkrumah's thinker behind the scene.
I see. What years are we talking about
We're
now?
talking about the early 50s. We're talking about the Nkrumah came back to Ghana in 1947. And so there was 10 years before independence. He eventually became head of the caretaker government preparing the nation for independence. And he would take the members of the United Gold Coast Convention, the semi-political organization, and develop the first truly political organization, the Convention People's Party, that led Ghana to independence.
Did the pronouncements of Marcus Mosiah Garvey have any impact on Kwame Nkrumah?
It had a great impact on his nationalistic thinking and his attempt to advocate and try to bring about the total unity of all Africa. It had some influence on his development of the concept of the Organization of African Unity, the African Solidarity Conference, but George Padmore did most of the thinking.
Okay. Now let's get to what must be done for Africa by Africans. What conclusions did you derive from the conference, Professor Hoover?
Well, at one of the plenaries, one of the Ghanaians stood up. There had been great debates about African Americans' involvement in the Nkrumah overthrow. There had been discussions about African involvement in the slave trade. And one gentleman made what I thought was a beautiful statement that summed up the conference for me. He said, whatever mistakes we have made as Africans, and African Americans, we must come together as Africans. And he said he hoped that we would move towards some sort of a foundation which would centralize the funding. Many of us took books to the Du Bois Library, made donations to the Du Bois Library. Some made donations to the new Nkrumah, the Nkrumah Monument, which is a gorgeous monument that has just come up. He hoped, because of the poverty in Ghana, the poverty in the United States, the poverty wherever we are, that we could come up somehow as African Americans with this foundation. And it was at the end of one of the last plenaries, and I thought it was an excellent way to end, because I think we can do a lot to help. One of the legacies of this meeting is, I believe there's going to be quite a step up in trips to Ghana. People have been going to Egypt quite a bit, which is also good. But while we were there, the social workers also had a conference, and so did a group from the DuSable Museum in Chicago. So I think this is going to continue to be, we will step up their economy by traveling there more, and I hope a foundation of some sort will come out of it.
Okay, let's take a break. We've got a lot of ground to cover, and we'll resume our chase for information right after this. Our brothers and sisters in Ghana, young people.
Education in Ghana is still a continuation of colonial education. Ghanaians are trying, but they have not fully succeeded in developing a Ghanaian-oriented and an African-oriented education. They're trying to get rid of the old colonial textbooks and the old colonial approach.
Well, colonial textbooks wouldn't teach, I would think, much about the process of colonialism.
They wouldn't teach...
or colonization.
Colonial textbooks merely teach the glorification of your former colonial master and the kings of his country. There are Ghanaians who are not well versed in Ghanaian history, and what is being fastened on Ghana, which interferes with education, interferes with everything, is a new image. Ghana is almost a nation of Jesus freaks. I mean, all kinds of religions are there bidding for the soul of Ghana, and yet poverty is increasing, and no one's looking after the common ordinary Ghanaian who's more and more disenchanted.
Mm-hmm. Professor Small, what contacts did you make on the grassroots level in your stay? Let me begin by asking, did you stay for the most part in Accra, or did you travel around? And what contacts did you make on the grassroots level?
Well, we traveled around. Our trip, the conference was sort of a cap of our trip. It's a trip we make every summer, and we visit the central region, the eastern region, the western region, and the greater Accra region, as well as the Kumasi region. And what we did was to visit about 13 of the dungeons and forts that was used to imprison our people before being transferred to the ships in the slave trade. And in visiting these, we also visit the villages around these forts and dungeons, because most of these villages are made up of the residue of people brought from the hinterland to the shore who didn't go on the ships. So these are probably our most immediate relatives.
Did you find that they were conversant about the whole process of the enslavement, the slave trade?
No. In the villages, we found that people knew they were such a thing as African Americans, but had little or no knowledge, except for the intellectuals in the community. The common people had little or no knowledge of the experience we had gone through. And when we stop in the villages and share our information and our history with people, they're amazed. And
wait a minute, how could they not know if they were in proximity with these slave forts?
They know something happened. They know there was a lot of us taken away. They do not know the facts of that process.
I see.
So, like when we visited, I think it was Fort Dix Cove, and this is a major fort. I think Dr. Clarke can help me. The British had this fort initially, or the Dutch had it initially, and the British took it. The young man that showed us around was very versed on the history of what happened to the enslaved Africans while at Dix Cove, but very little knowledge of what happened once they were placed on the ships.
This was your first trip, Dr. Hoover, to Ghana. What was the impact? Tell me what you experienced in going to the slave forts.
Well, it was a very painful experience. The most enjoyable experience was a visit to Nkrumah's new dedicated statue, which I mentioned. It's a huge tree with the head cut off to symbolize his unfinished mission. That was a very, very, very high point. And we were lucky to be the first people to see the inside of it. There are pictures of Nkrumah with various groups and so on. So that was the high point. The saddest part was the trip to the slave forts, and to see there's a chapel there with Psalm 132 written over the top of it. It showed the hypocrisy of these people.
Help me with that psalm. What does
two chapels at Elmina. That's the largest.
Right.
What was the essence of that psalm?
The psalm was something to do with David, preserve me in my time away from home, or something like that. So here's a group of people who have murdered 100 million Africans, some say 200 million, and yet there's this chapel inside the fort. Right next to the chapel is a room with a skull and bones over it. And this was the room for the revolutionaries who rebelled. They were thrown in there and starved to death. And to see the very narrow point of no return, we had to, the slaves had to go, the Africans who were to be enslaved had to go through this very tiny area. And the purpose for this, we were told, was to prevent any sort of rebellion, because we, of course, are very rebellious people, a very strong people. And so to prevent any sort of grouping together on the way to the ship, one by one, our forefathers had to go through this very narrow
passageway.
Right.
I see. How long is this passageway, roughly? Real long, 100 feet or 10 feet or what?
I couldn't look down. I just saw people. I just went.
Oh, it's a slope? It's a slope?
It's a hole in the wall, basically.
Wow.
People had to be
led to a ladder that would be outside,
right,
that would take you into the boats, that would take you to the ships.
Mm-hmm.
And all of these dungeons have such a door. On the coast of Ghana alone, I think there's about 50 of those. We think a lot of time of Goree Island, where there's one. But in just this one country, there was originally about 50. There's 35 that's still there. We visit on average 12 of them every summer. They remind you, the closest thing they can remind you of is the Dachau and the Buchenwald and the concentration camps of Europe.
I want to talk to you some more about this. Whenever we talk about slave forts and the whole enslavement process, it moves me to learn as much as I can. I hope you'll agree. Stay with us if you do. Unhealthy to continue to go back to this experience where we set forth for this side of the Atlantic. You know, there are some who argue very strenuously that it only fosters hatred, and it widens the gap between the races, and we ought to put these things behind us and move forward. You've heard that.
Oh, let's face it, this was our Holocaust. Mm-hmm. It was at least 200 times more disastrous than that unfortunate affair in Europe.
Why do you say that?
And it is because numerically, Africa lost maybe 150 to 200 million human beings, and this process went on for 300 years, only to lose still more millions in the colonial system, in the colonial wars. We must remind our children of this so that it will never happen again, and we must also remind them of the long years of achievement we had before it happened, so that they will know what still must be done to make sure it never happens again.
Why do you keep revisiting the slave fort, Professor Small?
I have a ring. It's called Sankofa. It means to go back and fetch it.
Hold it up like this, if you can.
It's
Maybe we can get a tight shot of it.
Yeah, with its head looking back. It is the symbol of going back into your history in order to determine your future. And anyone who understands the social process realizes that you must relate to traditions, you must relate to history, you must relate to events of the past in order to fashion the future. One of our problems have been, as African Americans especially, is our inability to access the past so that we can define what our role should be in the future. And so in going back each year, we take students with us so that we could begin to map out the history that needs to be remembered. When we celebrate Christmas, remember, we are remembering an historical event. When you celebrate Yom Kippur, when you celebrate Rosh Hashanah, those are historical events that is remembered by a people to give them a focal point to set their time. We must be able to determine what our timeline is so that we can fashion our realities. We should never forget not only the enslavement of our people, but we should never forget, and one thing, when we go to those villages near those forts, you are showered with love and affection. There is no such thing as rejection. And as we learn more about who we are, that love and affection gets so much deeper. It's like going home every summer, truly going home. And what we've been able to do is to, as we adopt hospitals and schools and take medical supplies and school supplies across the country to cement this attachment, we also share our history and they share their history. And one of the most incredible things that I wasn't aware of was the degree to which our people resisted the enslaving process and the many, many wars fought by our people not to allow this thing to exist. And the pride and the sadness that you find together, having fought so hard not to allow this to happen, but having to suffer that it happened. And one other thing, Gil, most people do not realize that the age group for the average enslaved African was somewhere between, especially for women, between 10 years and 25. So for 300 or more years, Africa was depleted of its children and young people.
Another reason why it's important to study this history is many of our young people suffer from historical amnesia, as we call it. All of us have or teach currently in Black Studies departments, but there are not that many of them across the country. There are not, in California, for example, there are a number of Black Studies departments, there are a number in New York. I think there were 70 of us there. But by and large, African Americans are not exposed to this information, and we need to know this information. So yes, many students are coming along. They don't understand that there are problems. They don't understand why we still have problems. This information about the slave trade, the history before the slave trade, is very important, I think, for African Americans in general.
It is my understanding that there are not many institutions of higher learning in this country where African history is required.
Even the Black colleges, there are only a handful of Black colleges.
And this is where it should have started, and this is where the role model should have been initiated for the rest of the country.
Is the same true in Ghana, that in higher education or on any level of education?
They require 2 courses in African Studies at the University of Ghana, Legon.
How about in
one
the
at
lower?
Howard. One at Howard. So,
one?
Yes. So.
What about in Ghana? What did you see over there? How many, what about elementary school?
Well, once again, they do have a new series of textbooks, which is the beginning, which try to reflect the Ghanaian history and so forth. But there are the same contradictions there that we have here of
Who wrote
pictures.
these books?
They were written actually by Ghanaians. F. Sutherland, one of the local Ghanaian authors, has some of her folk tales. They were just developed over the summer. So there is some attempt to...
The best of the textbooks is written by a former Jesuit, retired now, Father Bow. He has written some of the finest basic texts on the history of Ghana and the history of Africa and the world in general. His work is not as widely used as it should be. But Ghana is making an honest effort to look at Africa from an African point of view.
Okay, let's take another pause. We'll continue with more. Stay with us. In the education process in Ghana, as you say, there's a beginning, but up until recently it's been sort of flaccid, the teaching process about African history written by Africans. Many have said here in the United States that some of the urban unrest, that famous word, among young people is rooted, at least in part, by the poor education and knowledge of self from the education process in this country. If the same exists in Ghana, the same deficiency in education exists in Ghana, why is it that we hear so little about problems with young people in nations like Ghana?
Well, there's not as many problems, but you still have problems because most young people have no gainful employment, And when I went to Ghana at first, at 1958, the word prostitute would shock people, just the very word. And now, recently, you can barely enter a hotel and get past the solicitors. Something that previously not only did not exist in Ghanaian society, but previous to the advent of foreigners did not exist in African societies. We quite forget that most of the social ills of Africa, including female circumcision, was brought in by foreigners and did not previously exist in Africa, in spite of all the silly books and documents trying to prove the contrary.
Yes, may I comment on and use a term that I've been trying to coin, that Africans both here in the United States and on the continent, as well as the Caribbean, Central South America, we are suffering from a condition called post-slavery trauma syndrome. And what I mean by that, culture and history is how people give meaning to things and events. And during the period of slavery in the United States or in the Western Hemisphere, and that brand of slavery in Africa, which we call colonialism, but was slavery, we were denied the opportunity to determine the meaning of events by use of our culture and by use of our history. And when you denied the opportunity to utilize your culture and your history to determine what things mean to you, the events of your life, and to fashion new events, then you've been damaged in some serious ways. And since the end of quote-unquote slavery in the Americas and slavery on the continent, or the end of what is called colonialism, we have not had the opportunity to reconstruct the African cultural personality. And you will only be able to do that by accessing and studying African historical events. And I think the conference this summer allowed us a big step in that direction. It was a big step in examining that historical event and to begin to deal with what harm it has brought to us and what we need to do to reconstruct our situation.
Is it intelligent to sectionalize the impact of this horrific experience on women as opposed to men? Or is that a bad move to segregate?
No, I don't think it's a bad move. I think we have to see the effects on our total people, and then we have to see the effects on our institutions. And our feminine institutions as well as our masculine institutions, because Africa, being a very old place, had devised some beautiful institutions for organizing society.
What do you say, Dr. Hoover?
Well, the market impressed me. That was another very, very high point in Ghana, to see the Ghanaian market.
This question.
To women.
Okay.
And to see the role that women play in that market.
Okay.
They're quite active there. The market is a direct, there's no middle person in the middle.
Okay.
Marketeers are entrepreneurs who make their own money. It was just a delight to see African women in the marketplace. A majority of the merchants there are women. And we'd like to see something like that happen here. I think if we had more kinds of gainful and positive opportunities for employment such as that, though there is a great unemployment level in Ghana, we would have less unrest. If we had less miseducation, for example, we are 48% illiterate here in the United States. African Americans, those of us whose ancestors invented the alphabet. In Ghana, there's also an illiteracy rate, so we have similar problems. One of the advantages there is that they have their land, which gives them a certain pride and identity that it's going to take us a long time to get. We're going to have more required Black Studies courses, more required courses for not just Africans, but for the whole country, before we're ever going to get that identity it's crucial for.
But what
for
I
us
was after is your answer to a question I posed to Professor Small. Should historians and educators sectionalize their study of the impact that the whole Holocaust, if you will, against Africans, the impact it has had on women as opposed to the impact it has had on men? I was just wondering.
Well, there are always differences, of course, according to gender. But I think the Holocaust itself had just a devastating effect on Africa in general. There are always going to be specific kinds of things. For example, our unemployment here, 46% of black men are unemployed. Black females are underemployed and have other problems, very serious ones. But there are differences. So usually what happens, racism cuts with an even knife in terms of the genders. Some may suffer more from one evil and others from another.
Professor Clarke.
Let's dig a little deeper. It was in Africa that the mother was first declared a deity. It was in Africa that the first female god appeared, and the first matrilineal society appeared. In most African societies, it's still matrilineal, meaning the lineage comes down to the female side. It was also in Africa that men were secure enough to let a woman go as far as her mind could take her without feeling threatened. Away from Africa and under the domination of foreigners, men of the African world have taken on some traits alien to the culture that has produced us. We were never anti-women. We never divided ourselves into such camps, woman on one side, we on the other side. We know, because African society taught us that you couldn't be a god unless you had a goddess. You couldn't be a king unless you had a queen. And we didn't argue about the better half. We didn't get into nonsense conversation like this. We recognized the woman as the giver of life.
By matrilineal, you mean that we took our names from our mothers, not our fathers?
The lineage came down through the female side. She made the major decision, meaning that the lineage of kinship came down through the female side other than the father's side.
May I add a little something to that?
You may, but you need to wait for a break. We need to take still another. We'll be back with more.
What Dr. Clarke was saying, talking about the lineage coming down through the women. In Africa and in Ghana, there's a unique experiment going on. I don't know how well it's being appreciated even by the Ghanaians, but there's two governments. There is the contemporary government led by the President Rollins, and there is the traditional government led on the local level by the Omnahini, or what we would call a chief, but higher than that. And under the Omnahini are other levels of the structure. To be chosen for this position, your line must be traced through your mother and her mothers in order for you to qualify to sit in this leadership role. And the person who's chosen to take the leadership or the stool, is the decision on that person is made by the women of the community, led by the queen mother of the community, and that name is then given to the male elders. So even the leadership of Africa, the critical leadership, is chosen by the female and not by the males, even though this critical leadership may be male.
You know, recently a king from Ghana visited, and it might be of some assistance to all of us to have a discussion, brief as it will have to be, about the separation of powers between the natural lineage of the kingdoms among the various peoples in Africa, as opposed to the governmental structure that we know. And what strikes me in thinking about this is the point that was made earlier, that it is a matrilineal heritage that we have in Africa. Do we find many queens in Africa now, or is it mostly kings?
Well, you find the male up front, but like the Baptist Church in the United States, the female behind the scene determined the direction of that church.
Yes.
In Africa, the woman is the king maker,
Yes.
and she is the king breaker. And that needs to be appreciated.
Yes.
But you don't have the male-female fight in Africa that you have over here, because over here, too many people are imitating white women's live. And white women's live, and that mission don't have anything to do with the plight of black people. It's not even about the plight of black people. I'm saying you need an organization of black women, better and bigger, but not for their reasons. You need it for your reasons.
But you know that there are many African American women who are going to fight you on that.
I want them to fight me on it. I'm ready for the fight.
As African Americans, we gave the tactics of struggle to women, to gays. We made that contribution to them. And so it's not that we are opposed as such as African American women. It's a tradition that we have always had, which they took to an extreme. But African women, as Dr. Clarke and Dr. Smalls have stated, have led the way in the world toward what Diop called harmonious dualism, where you don't have the man 20 steps in front or the woman 20 steps in front, but a harmonious dualism. And so we know that this is a historical fact among African women, and so some work with feminists. Most African American women work in African American organizations in general, or African American women organizations. Okay.
Now, in my limited awareness of Ghana, the economy of Ghana, even though it is an independent state, the economy of Ghana, like most African nations, still resides in the hands of outsiders. What did the educational conference give you that you can give to us as a means of remedying that equation?
Well, until you remedy the fact that most of the wealth-producing resources in Africa are still managed by foreigners, the African won't be doing much to improve his economy, that he is under almost the whip and the tutelage or the enslavement of the World Bank, because they borrowed money over and beyond what they can pay and can't pay back the interest easily, let alone the principal. Africa has to develop its own internal resources to the point that it will be free of these foreign entanglements while still having foreign connections and legitimate trade connections. So
are there a lot of, are you saying that there are a lot of European businessmen who are adventurously pursuing things in Ghana? And making, not only in Ghana, but all over Africa, like gold. Ghana is selling part of its gold mines to South Africa. You know that's a trap. Selling its banks to an American banking chain. You know that's a trap. When you cannot manage the basic wealth of your country, you cannot remain sovereign, because the outside manager is going to tell you when to devaluate your money and when who to employ and how to employ. And you have to make a clear distinction between Reverend Sullivan's pan-capitalism and pan-African nationalism. Okay, I want to talk more about that and the question of outside management of our existence. But we have an outside manager on the floor now who's dictating that we need to take a break, and I must obey. But we will be back, I promise. Education conference. How does what was discussed at the conference really translate into action? It's one thing to confer and rap and discuss. It's another thing to do something with it. What did you see coming out of this conference that has some real meat on it?
Well, the National Conference on Black Studies, which is 17 years old, is developing a relationship with Ghana so that we can take our students from here over there and have an exchange kind of a program. So that's one step. That will take some resources into Ghana. Once again, I think our conference was significant. There were 500 of us. At the same time, the social workers were there and a group from the Salva Museum in Chicago. I think that we will begin to make a contribution by stepping up our travel there. And then the recommendation, again, that was made at the end of the conference that I hope we've suggested to the Conference on Black Studies that they follow up on this foundation. We have a situation here where billions of dollars have been donated recently to a library in Washington, and that's excellent. But when people can't eat, I think we also need a foundation that will help the Ghanaians to have more funds that they're available to them.
What was the tone of the exchanges between educators from this side of the Atlantic with our blood brothers in Ghana?
Extremely harmonious, because
Really?
The best
I
I've ever,
thought it was wonderful.
the best that I have ever encountered. No basic arguments, no strong difference of opinion. Occasionally some misconceptions and misinformation, and one Ghanaian thought that Franklin Williams helped to overthrow Nkrumah, which is not true, because they never assign a lowly ambassador to a job as monumental as the overthrow of a government. That means he don't seem to understand that the overthrow of a government is a thing on high level, and that they superficially keep the ambassador's hands clean. Now, Franklin Williams might have been guilty of something, but overthrowing the government, he was not. He didn't even have the mental capacity, the skillful capacity for a thing as high as that.
All right,
because
now,
it wasn't his assignment.
Don't start.
Well,
Professor Small, did you see any educators from Europe? Were any whites there at all?
they were the only two whites that I observed were reporters from Zimbabwe.
No educators?
No educators that I observed.
Were any questions raised about there not being any European representatives?
No, I think our people are beginning to understand, as Malcolm once said, that families sometimes have to go into a room by themselves to take care of business. And I think that's what we were about. I'd like to mention, because I think it actually helped this conference, last summer, Dr. Leonard Jeffries and myself, along with 100 others, and with the complement of African scholars and community people, held a 2-day Pan-African conference in Ghana, discussing much of the same issues. And I think we've set the stage for a lot of things, and this massive conference that we just had will set an even greater stage, so that we're watching yesterday a delegation leave from East Orange, New Jersey, under Mayor Cooper, to go to Ghana as a trade mission. I was in Richmond 2 days ago, and there was a summit of African leaders, vice presidents, and other state officials, along with 10 governors, hosted by Governor Waldo of Virginia, holding a trade conference, and they signed a non-binding trade agreement.
How about some youngsters from our urban centers going?
Well, we take youngsters every year. 1 year we were able to
Those
take
most
30.
in need. You know what I mean
That's
when
the
I
way
say that.
We tried to choose. Now, most of the youngsters that go with us are youngsters in college, but these are the kids from the urban centers.
You think taking some street kids, for lack of a better word?
I think it would be the best thing that could happen to them. The African Poetry Theater in Queens, and as well as Brother Dix from the Bronx, each of those groups take a large number of our street children to Africa every year, and I think there's a group out in Mount Vernon that does the same thing. I think the more interaction we have, the closer we will become emotionally and psychologically as a people, and the greater the opportunity for the kind of interaction that would be necessary. I'd like to say just one other thing that came out of that conference.
Better be quick, we're running out of time.
That is using the skills, the management skills, and the technical training that the African American have to help enhance the development of Africa. And I think those relationships further that interaction.
Is there anything you'd like to close with, Professor Hoover?
just a Malcolm quote. He said that you left your mind in Africa, and we must go back and reclaim our minds. We have to go back.
Professor Clarke.
We must stop dividing ourselves based on where the slave ships put us down, and remember where the slave ships took us from. Wherever we are on the face of this earth, we are an African people.
Thank you, Professor Clarke, Professor Hoover, and Professor Small. Thank you for being with us. For a transcript of this program, send $4 to Journal Graphics, 1535 Grant Street, Denver, Colorado, 80203. To place a credit card order, call 1-800-TALK-SHOW.